Thank you so much for the opportunity and the invitation, those of you that were on the committee and deciding who to have come and speak. I was delighted when I got the invitation, and I knew for sure that I wanted to do it, and here I am, and I'm so happy to be here. I love coming back to Michigan. I was talking with some folks today, various points of the day. I just love being in a place where all the plants are so familiar to me. I recognize what they are. I've been living in California for 12 years, and there's still a lot of stuff there that I don't know. I'm going to, a lot of what you're hearing while you're here is helping you run your business and teaching you things about pasture management and very important tools like that. And my talk is going to be about something quite different. It's going to be about the public conversation. And honestly, the majority of you probably know more about how to raise cattle well than I do, and you know more about probably marketing grass-fed beef and a lot of the other topics that are being discussed here at this conference. But what I'm really good at is, first of all, understanding the environmental side of this whole question, and secondly, how the issue is being discussed in the public. And what really motivated me to write Defending Beef is something that I think you all need to be urgently considering. And that is, I was increasingly persuaded that beef was being kind of misrepresented in the public conversation, and so vastly oversimplified in terms of what the issues were that it was actually wildly inaccurate. And because I have kind of an unusual combination of characteristics and experiences, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, I felt I was someone who could make the argument that cattle were not only not inherently destructive to the environment, but actually are essential to a sustainable food system. And what Defending Beef, my book, is all about, and what I'm going to be talking about tonight, is sort of arming the people in this room with some of the language and some of the ideas about how to discuss this with people that you might encounter that are skeptical of that claim. And I think this is really, really important because you all are doing an incredibly important service from an ecological standpoint as well as from a food system standpoint. And yet there's increasingly, in my view, the perception, as one of the speakers said earlier today, that beef is a four-letter word, that it's just like the less of it, the better. And I think that's very unfortunate, and we need to respond to that. So what I'm going to do is kind of go through some of the main issues that I talk about in my book, and because you all are so sophisticated in terms of your knowledge about a lot of these topics, I'm going to breeze over some things, and I'm also going to get really in depth in some things. And then when I'm done talking, I really welcome your questions. So I want to start with, I always start with a picture of my husband Bill Niman and me together on our ranch in California, because he's such an essential part. We really are a team. We actually do some speaking and some writing together, but we also, like many of you in this room, I'm sure, work as a team every single day, running our business, running our ranch, and raising our two sons. And so he's really the other half of the partnership that I'm a part of. And Bill also has an amazing background as far as the number of years that he's been working on trying to create really wholesome and delicious and sustainably raised meat. And of course, it was mentioned that he's the founder of the Niman Ranch Company. He actually left that company 7 years ago, and actually I think it's 8 years ago now, and we founded together the company BN Ranch that we now are running and trying to make a profitable business out of. And it's a totally grass-based meat company. We raise beef ourselves, and we are also working with a network of ranchers that are raising grass-fed beef, totally grass-fed beef, and follow the protocols that we want followed. And we're also raising pasture-based turkeys, both heritage and non-heritage breeds. And we are working with an excellent lamb rancher as well that my husband has known for about 15 years, who's raising totally grass grass-fed lamb. So we're offering, our little company has those 3 meat offerings. And I'll be happy to answer any questions people have about that. But that's not what I'm really here to talk about. I'm mostly here to talk about this sort of big picture question of what is really the impact of beef that's well raised on the environment. So first of all, I don't think I have to explain it to this group, but just in case there's anyone that hasn't been hearing a lot of negative stuff about beef, I'll just tell you there's a lot of negative stuff out there. And I lived in New York City for 5 years before moving to the Bay Area, where we live now near San Francisco. And it really, if you are talking to an urban person in the United States today, and especially in a place like that, chances are about 95% that their belief is that they should eat as little beef as possible, both for health and ecological reasons. Somebody in the Audubon folks earlier talked about that, this incredible chasm between urban understandings about these issues and what's really happening on the grasslands of the United States. But I can just tell you with absolute certainty that beef needs to be defended because it is definitely under attack. I'm just going to quickly go through a few of the main criticisms that I think have been lodged towards beef over the last few decades, and I've kind of put them in chronological order, roughly. And some of them are not as much topical today, but these are all still very much in the public conversation. First, a lot of people, especially out in the California and the western part of the United States, will tell you that overgrazing primarily by cattle has destroyed the American West, and they'll often say, and much of the world. And especially these are people who might have read Jeremy Rifkin's book, Beyond Beef, which basically blames every single bad thing that's ever happened on cattle. And these are, of course, all in quotes because these are all statements I adamantly disagree with, but these are statements that are out there quite a bit. Around that same time, I'd say like around 1970 roughly, you started to really hear a lot of talk about how people should reduce their beef consumption due to concerns of saturated fat. And people also sort of from that said, well, it makes you fat, it causes heart disease and diabetes. And I'm astonished by how many people still believe this because it's totally been debunked. But this is a very common belief and a very common criticism of beef. Next is a criticism that it comes and goes, but it's very topical right now because California is in the worst drought. There was just an article yesterday that scientists are now saying it's the driest it's been in 500 years in California. So very often people are concerned about this, again, especially in certain regions. And it's saying beef is far too water intensive for our water stressed state, meaning California or certain other drought areas, or world. And the next statement is, so we really just need to basically get rid of it and over time reduce it to as little as possible. And finally, the criticism that I think I've heard the most frequently in the last 5 years or so, and truly it was what really prompted me to write this book, Defending Beef, is this idea that beef is a leading cause of climate change. And I'm going to talk about this in some depth in a few minutes, but I'll just say there's even a vegan advocacy movie that's out there that some of you might have heard of called Cowspiracy, which is a completely absurd piece of junk, by the way, but it's worth watching because it's so absurd and it shows you where some of this public dialogue is going. And that movie repeatedly states that more than 51%, so over half of climate change is being caused by beef cattle. Now, that is so wildly inaccurate that if there were any kind of like FDA labeling claim process for movies, that thing would have never made it through the first review. But there's no process like that, so movie makers can say whatever they want. And that movie has actually been seen by thousands of young people all over the United States. And I can't tell you how often I see it cited in places, especially on Facebook. So it's having some influence. So we need to be able to respond to it intelligently and with the facts, okay? Let's go on to what I think about how do we respond? Okay, so obviously this gathering is all about grass, and it's all about soils, and it's all about having animals on grass. So probably almost everybody's already familiar with this quote from Senator John James Ingalls in 1872, referring to grass and the beneficence of grass. And when he talked about grass, he talked about it as something, he talked about it in almost sort of biblical terms, as something that sort of was all about the cycle of life, that animals ate the grasses and we ate those animals and we returned to the soils when we died and we fed those grasses, and the kind of ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And I very much believe that's still fundamentally the key to this whole issue. But to make it a little more specific in terms of the facts, and again, I'm going to talk about all this in a little more detail in a few minutes, but basically the key to grass, of course, is that it is a protective covering on the earth, and it protects the soils, it protects the waters, it builds fertility wherever it is, whether it's part of a rotation, a crop rotation, or whether it's just continuous grass covering. When you have it as part of a crop rotation, it controls weeds and pests. Some of you might have, in my book, Defending Beef, I talked about the Journal of Agriculture, the annual journal that the USDA has put out. I think they still do it, I'm not sure. But I believe it was in 1948, they published a volume that was just called Grass, and it was all about how grass was the future of agriculture. And it's kind of tragic to read it, because it was all about how wonderful grass is and how it's going to be the basis of the American agricultural system, and then everything changed, shortly thereafter. But one of the things that book talks a lot about is how beneficial grass is as part of a rotation in terms of controlling weeds and pests. And then finally, the final point, and this is what the Audubon folks were talking about earlier today, wherever you have grass areas, you have abundant food and habitat for all of the wild animals. And I just said the birds and the bees as kind of shorthand, but in fact, the birds and the bees are two of the really important sectors of the animal world that really benefit from having the grasslands, and I'm going to talk more about that. So in my book, Defending Beef, I spend almost half of it talking about the nutritional side of the question. Because one of the things I realized when I started thinking about this book was I could make an amazing environmental case for it, but if the reader still felt that it was unhealthy food, then we probably shouldn't be raising it, right? So it was incredibly important to go through that issue in the book as well. It's not my primary expertise, and so when I talk to folks, I usually don't focus very much on it because there are lots of other people who know a lot more about nutrition and health than I do. But I delve into it in quite a bit of depth because I thought it was really important to go through the history of the thinking about beef and saturated fat, red meat, and to basically point out that the science that was kind of considered, very solid 30 years ago has been completely rethought over the last few decades. And I trace it in a lot of depth in the book. But just the one point I wanted to make is that beef is a uniquely nutritious food. So the idea that we just really don't even need it is, I think, totally false right there, because there are many nutrients that we get from beef that beef is a very, very good source of, and that are actually that many people are short of, or are deficient of. So I just mentioned protein, iron, zinc, and B12 as some of the key nutrients that you get from beef. And in each of those cases, this is a nutrient that is uniquely, the body is uniquely able to use the nutrient from when it comes from a red meat source. So for example, iron is really clear on this because there's a totally different type of iron in vegetable sources than there is in red meat. And the type of iron that's in vegetable sources is very hard for the body to utilize. And so mainstream, very credible health organizations all recommend that you should have at least twice as much of that type of iron if that's your sole or primary source of the iron. And even then, it's not assured that your body's really going to fully absorb it because it's so much harder for the body to use it. Now, iron, you might be thinking, well, you know, in America, there aren't very many iron deficient people. Well, a couple of things about that. One is there's a lot of research now showing that there's a much greater amount of iron deficiency than was typically believed in the Western world. In the developing world, all of these nutrients are severely problematic. So about 50% of the world's population is deficient in each of these things. But even in the United States, there are significant deficiencies in certain populations. So like with iron, it's now believed that about 30% of pregnant women get enough iron. And there's actually some really interesting research that's been coming out in the last couple of years showing that even if a woman during her pregnancy has what's considered an acceptable level of iron, but it's kind of low, that may be problematic because there's been shown to be a correlation between the woman's iron level and the rate of autism. Now, this is very preliminary research and it might never turn out to be anything. But it's been shown basically the more iron you have in your blood as a pregnant woman, the better. So these are very important issues even for Americans today who have lots of choices of food, and we live in a country and a time of abundance. But it should not be overlooked, the fact that beef is uniquely nutritious and provides a very important part of the nutrition that people need. Okay, I said I was just going to talk about that for a minute, and that was more than a minute. But I just do think this is a really important part of the conversation. But I'm not going to say anything else about the nutrition unless somebody asks me about it. So from this point forward, I'm going to talk about the environmental issues. Okay, so soil is undoubtedly, again, everybody in this room is very focused on this. Most people in sort of the mainstream populace, even in the agriculture world, I think, are not that focused on soil. I think that's changing a little bit. But the main reason why grass is so important, and especially when you contrast it with land that's plowed and used to grow crops on, is the fact that grass is such a good environment for so many things that relate to the soil that we need. Grass holds the soil really well. It's physically holding it there. And on average, about 90% of the grass plant is below ground. And of course, that's because the roots are, in some cases, 10 feet, 12 feet long, depending on the species. And that physical, dense, tangled network of roots is really, really important for keeping the soil. And wherever you have that environment, you have basically an optimal subterranean environment. And one thing I really realized as I was researching for this book is that for decades there's been lots of conversation about the chemistry of soil, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium, whatever, the calcium. And there's been lots of attention to the physical properties of soil. But the biology of soil is a relatively recent focus for a lot of scientists. And increasingly it's being realized that that biology might actually be the most important aspect of soil. And when you have a dense vegetative cover, such as you do in a grassland, you have this optimal subterranean environment when it's well managed. And this has to do with the microorganisms primarily, both the diversity and the number of the microorganisms, which are both important, the nutrients in the soil, the fertility, the glomalin, and I don't know if it's been talked about here at all today, but I talk about it quite a bit in my book. Glomalin is now believed possibly to be the key to carbon sequestration by some people. And then, of course, the carbon itself. So where you have healthy grass covering, all of those things are going to be in better shape than just about any other form of land use, whether agricultural or other. Now, the water issue, I mentioned it already at the beginning, has two components to it. One is the quantity of water and one is the quality of water. And I think in both cases, there's a tremendous amount of misunderstanding and misinformation about there. So let's start with water quantity. You very often hear, again, especially at times of drought, that beef is simply too water intensive, that we shouldn't be raising it anymore because beef cattle just consume too much water. And sometimes people talk about the processing as well, but actually that's a fairly small part of the whole, what it takes to get a pound of beef to the market. So there's not as much focus on that. But the first point is that the actual number, is a lot less than people assume. Now, you'll see a lot of numbers flying around the internet, but they often are in the thousands. 3,000 gallons of water per pound of beef is a really common number that you'll see. Now, part of the reason for that, sort of that ubiquity of those numbers, is because there are some fairly credible entities that have made those calculations. But a couple of really important points need to be made in response to that. First of all, that's for a typical pound of conventional feedlot beef using irrigated feeds. I mean, it's a worst case scenario number. And the second thing is, even if you are actually talking about a typical American pound of beef, which is the feedlot, it's not probably actually being fed irrigated feeds because that's actually a fairly small percentage of the feed that's used for cattle. But even if you are talking about a typical pound of beef, it's actually a far lower number than most people believe if you don't use what's called the green water in your calculation. The reason that number is so high is because cattle eat grass. And the number that you see, whether it's 3,000 or sometimes you even see 12,000 gallons per pound of beef, those numbers are all including the water that was in the grass. Now, to me, that's absurd. Okay, for a lot of different reasons, that's absurd. And if you want to look at all the calculations that have been done over the years, I think the most credible calculation on this number was done by the researchers at UC Davis, University of California at Davis, and they found that the number was about 440 pounds or gallons of water per pound of beef, which is about the same as what it takes to produce a pound of rice. So I think it's really important that people sort of be able to respond to that criticism, because it comes up an awful lot. And it's basically just based on faulty figures that are being misused. Now, this is especially true with grass-fed beef. A pound of, there aren't a lot of really good calculations out there on this, but in my book I sort of reviewed the information that's out there, and it's closer to about 100 gallons per pound. And of course, there's a very, very different cycle of the water, because if the cattle are always on grass, that water is just re-entering the environment and it's benefiting countless other organisms and the soil. And that critical piece of information is constantly lost in the public conversation. It's so obvious, and yet it's not understood in the general public. And finally, many of you have heard, I'm sure, the figure that the NRCS has come up with as far as how much good grazing benefits water in the soils. And they've said that every 1% of organic matter in an acre of soil holds about 27,000 additional gallons of water. So that's never added into the calculation, right? Is raising beef contaminating, polluting water? Well, it turns out really it's just the opposite, because there's a lot of research out there showing that when you have well-managed grazing, you're actually much more protective of both groundwater and surface waters. And when I worked for Waterkeeper Alliance, I was going to tell you a little bit about my background before I started, and I forgot to do that. So I'll tell you, I am from Kalamazoo College. I went to Kalamazoo College. I'm from Kalamazoo. I went to Kalamazoo College and majored in biology. I went to University of Michigan Law School. I then lived for a while in North Carolina, moved back to Kalamazoo, served on the city commission, et cetera, and was working as a lawyer for a firm. And then I worked for the National Wildlife Federation in Ann Arbor. And from there, I went to work for Bobby Kennedy Jr. in New York. And the reason I just thought of it right now, that I hadn't mentioned it, is that my work for both the National Wildlife Federation and for Bobby Kennedy Jr. at Waterkeeper Alliance was all about water protection. So this is actually how I got into the whole livestock issue, because Bobby was seeing everywhere that local water bodies, their primary pollution problem was from the livestock and poultry industry. Now, it's not that he was misinformed, but it was a totally different kind of livestock production. And I spent 2 years working for Bobby Kennedy Jr. in New York for Waterkeeper Alliance, going all around the country and seeing these operations for myself and meeting with the people who were doing the water sampling and visiting their homes and seeing the impact it was having. This was all about big confinement, concentrated livestock production, especially in the dairy and the poultry and the hog sector. But it had nothing to do with well-managed pasture-based agriculture, which has a totally different environmental impact when you're talking about water quality, because a dense vegetated cover is actually the best thing you can do to protect water quality, because it holds, again, it holds any kind of sediment, it holds the soils, it holds the nutrients there, it holds the water there, it acts as a filter. And I cited in my book, Defending Beef, I cite lots of different studies about this, showing how basically the best thing you can have if you want to have a good, let's say, a municipal water system, they want to have the rain falling onto well-managed grazing areas, because there's nothing that's going to make cleaner water downstream than a good pasture. So this particular figure here that I'm citing on this slide is some research that was done in Minnesota by the Land Stewardship Project a number of years ago, but it was trying to quantify what that benefit is. And it showed that there's about 80% less sediment coming off of a pasture versus a crop field. And the same thing is true of the nutrients. It was showing that at least 40% or more less runoff of those nutrients. So again, there's a perception out there that there's a water pollution issue, and in fact, especially if it's a well-managed grazing situation, the reverse is really true. Now, this slide just illustrates a little bit some of the things I've been talking about. This is, again, very familiar to all of you. When I do this talk to a typical American that's living in an urban area, they've never seen anything like this before, so this is really eye-opening for them. But it's just showing how dense and tangled that network of roots below ground is on grass. And the slide on the right, maybe a lot of you haven't seen that, that's something that was taken by USDA researchers that shows the glomalin that's underground. And glomalin is, it's kind of being debated within the scientific community about how important it really is. But USDA researchers discovered it in 1996 and named it. And their feeling was that this was absolutely the cornerstone of carbon sequestration. And their research has also been showing that the more, basically the more dense vegetative cover you have and the more continuously you have that cover. And actually, interestingly, native grasses are shown to have the highest levels of glomalin. But they're showing that basically the more of this you have in the soil, the more carbon sequestration you're going to have, and the longer the carbon is going to be sequestered for. So it could turn out to be an absolutely essential component of the soil carbon sequestration issue. And this is all about grass. So it's telling me that it's not working anymore. Some little thing just popped up. There's always technology to deal with. I think I was talking too long on that slide, maybe. Okay, thank you. Thank you for the help. So this is just a picture that, again, it's not one that I took. It's a gentleman by the name of Seth Itzkon took this picture and also did all the words on there, so I want to give him full credit for that. But what's interesting about this picture is this is showing grazing and grazing. So this is really comparing well-managed, in this case, holistically managed grazing versus non-managed or badly managed grazing. And so I think that's one of the really important points too that we all need to be sort of continually emphasizing when we're talking to people about this stuff, is that there's nothing intrinsic in grazing animals that's environmentally negative. It's all about how they're managed and all of the wonderful benefits that I've been talking about. I mean, there's a great quote by Wes Jackson, the founder of the Kansas-based Land Institute, where he says, even the worst managed ranch is less environmentally damaging than a typical crop production. So, and I think that's probably true, because his point is that you're not destroying that dense vegetative cover that's protecting the earth and protecting the soil and protecting waters. But there's still an enormous difference between good grazing, well-managed grazing, and poorly managed or unmanaged grazing. And this slide does a great job of illustrating that. And I just want to run through a couple examples of some of the kinds of research. This would be totally familiar to the people that were here earlier from the Audubon Society. This is basically one particular study where they were looking at well-managed grazing and comparing how much habitat was created for migrating birds versus in crop production. And they found essentially that there was a great deal more in a pasture versus a crop field, which makes sense to anybody that's involved in agriculture. So that's the birds, and here's the bees side of it. This is actually a reference to an article that I wrote for The Atlantic a few years ago, but it was talking about research that was done by biology professors at University of California, Berkeley, about bees. Now, again, in this room, probably everybody's very aware of the colony collapse disorder and how this is a huge worldwide crisis as far as food production. But what you might not know is that there's actually research focusing on wild pollinators because of their growing importance, largely because the domesticated bees are disappearing. And this particular study was done by Dr. Claire Kremen was the lead researcher on this, but a number of biologists at Berkeley, and they were looking at sort of trying to quantify what the role of the wild pollinators were, and they found that between 30 and 40% of the pollination in California's crop production. So this is going way beyond the benefits that the pasture itself provides ecologically and way beyond the food benefits that beef and dairy products provide, right? This is talking about the crops. They found that 30 to 40% of those crops are being pollinated by wild pollinators, and that most of those pollinators reside in the rangelands specifically. So this was an incredibly important, piece of the puzzle that they put on the table, I thought. So the benefits go way beyond just beef and dairy products and even the benefits of pasture. It goes to the crop side as well. Now, let's look a little more specifically at and look at them separately. So in that op-ed, I did that, and I talked about each one separately and pointed out how for each gas, it's really much more a problem with the industrialized livestock sector than with smaller scale and especially grass-based production. But but what's really persisted in this whole issue, I think, is this question of methane. So for people that are raising any ruminant animals, the thing you're going to hear about is methane. And again, in this ridiculous film that I referred to already once, they keep saying 51% of climate change is being caused by cattle. But if you actually look at the numbers, the US EPA has done official calculations of this. The numbers that the US Environmental Protection Agency has calculated are the same numbers that are being used by the international community when they attribute, and in the United Nations on climate change negotiations, they use this same number, okay? And that number is 2% for all ruminants. That's all types of cattle, goats, sheep, and domesticated bison, okay? So that's essential. If you don't remember one single thing that I said tonight, please walk out of this room remembering it's 2%. Okay, so if anybody asks you about climate change, you just say, the US EPA says it's 2%. Okay, now 2% is an important number. I'm not saying it's not, but it ain't 51%, is it? So that's a really important thing to remember. Now, what else should we know about the methane issue? So methane, of course, is primarily produced from the digestive processes of cattle. And one thing I think it's really important to tell people and to remind people, actually to educate people on, because most people outside of the agricultural world wouldn't know this, is that when you're talking about methane from cattle and from the digestive processes, it's part of a double-edged sword. The very thing that is kind of the most amazing gift about cattle is that they can, and really all the grazing animals, is that they can live in areas where nobody else can live. You can't raise crops, you know, and there's nothing there for most animals, and certainly not for humans directly. And cattle do this miraculous thing of taking this essentially inedible vegetation and converting it to meat and milk. And as a byproduct of that, you get methane. So, you know, to a certain degree, I think there's always going to be some methane, and I think that's okay. There's going to be a downside to a lot of human activities. And I think although we need to try to mitigate methane and look at all these ways of sequestering carbon in the soil and offsetting it and all that, I think to a certain degree, it's the other edge of that double-edged sword, which is that cattle are these miraculous animals that convert areas of grass into food. So that's one point. The other point is that there is a lot of very good stuff happening all over the world in terms of methane mitigation. There's all kinds of research, and there are field trials all over the world at agricultural schools, and everything is being looked into, whether it's dung beetle populations or whether it's, you know, certain mineral additives to mineral blocks and so forth. And there's certain amount of success that's being discovered with this. And even you know, pasture management is being shown not just to help with the carbon sequestration side, but with the methane issue as well. And then, of course, there's the carbon sequestration. So there are lots of folks in the room that are way more of an expert at this than I am, but I've done a lot of reading at it about this topic for writing my book. And there's a lot of debate about how much carbon can be sequestered, but there's no debate that it could be a very significant amount. And one thing I've been doing in my sort of talks in California is to sort of try to continually advocate this idea that we should be looking at pasture management for the state of California, not just as a drought reduction, a drought fighting strategy, but also as a climate change strategy, because Jerry Brown is very, very focused on climate change, our governor. And in fact, I've been informed in the last couple of months that there is something that has made it through the legislative process that is going to be assisting in terms of pasture management for climate change purposes. So I'm glad to see that rising to that level. But I want to tie one other thing in. This whole issue of climate change really came to the surface with the Livestock's Long Shadow report in 2006, which was a United Nations report, which said that that's where the 18% figure came from. And one of the other things I think it's important to know is that's for all livestock, okay? That includes chickens and pigs and everything else. It's a global figure. The numbers are actually quite different for the United States. And also, even that number was reduced by the FAO, the same agency that produced the 18% number, reduced it to 14% in 2013. So they themselves brought that number down, but that's for all of the livestock species. And the US number is 2%. So I think that's really, really important. That's for all the ruminants. What I'm arguing in defending beef is that we really have to look at this issue from a much longer term perspective. And we have to encourage people who are criticizing the raising of beef or the consumption of beef to do the same thing. We so often, when we're talking about any public issue, we have a very short time frame that we think about. But I've noticed this absolutely with myself, for sure, but other people in the environmental community a lot. They look at things the way they are now, and they think that's the way it was meant to be. So I'm going to show some slides in a moment of our ranch. I now live on a ranch that is actually it's a very southern tip of a national park. And there's a whole area of that park just north of us where there's nothing happening as far as human activity. And people look at that and they think, well, that's how the environment is supposed to look. But you know what's there now, other than trees? Pretty much nothing. Okay, I mean, there are birds and there are, gophers and stuff like that. But we're in this exact same spot, there were once 18 megafauna that were there for millions of years. There were enormous grazing animals and enormous populations of predators that were keeping those grazing animals moving and densely congregated. Those were covering California for millions of years. And yet when I talk about those species, for example, that there was a camel bigger than the camel that now exists in the Middle East. There were 2 types of lions. There was a tiger. There were 2 types of elephants. People actually look at me like I'm insane. I mean, they think, okay, I thought she was really smart and informed, but now I realize she's insane. It's all in the textbook, okay? The Grasslands textbook that's used at Berkeley. So I consider that a very good source, okay? But this is not well known. But what's happening is people look at the landscape that they're familiar with, and where human activity has been excluded, they think that's what the environment's supposed to look like, without any consideration of the tens of millions of years that huge herds of animals were having an impact on the way that land evolved, and the way all life and all of the soil organisms evolved for that land. It's like we have this collective amnesia about what the globe looked like. But in fact, we don't have amnesia because we actually never knew it for the most part, okay? So here's the longer term perspective that I'm arguing for. The beginning of life is believed to be about 3.8 billion years ago. Relatively recently, compared to that geological time frame, the dinosaurs disappeared about 66 million years ago. And around that same time, not too much later, were the beginning of grasses. And it's believed that by about 40 million years ago, there were widespread areas of grass all over the globe. Now, this is a really important point because, again, I encounter countless times, I've had this conversation where people will tell you that basically the earth was covered with trees, and that any place where there's a grassland is where humans went and cut down all the trees. Well, humans did do a lot of that, okay? But grasses have been on the globe for they've been on the globe for 60 million years, but they've been a widespread part of the globe for about 40 million years. And co-evolving, again, with those ecosystems were all these grazing animals and these predators that were keeping them moving. And there's a lot of evidence that the huge herds that once covered the globe far outnumbered the number of domesticated cattle that are there today, that are covering the globe today. So the point is, if we think of it from this much longer term perspective, we realize that the grazing animals are an essential component of the Earth's ecosystems. And the wild animals are pretty much gone. About 99% of the wild animals that once were on the globe are gone. And so we need these domesticated grazing animals to be the proxy for the disappeared wild animals. And I'm borrowing the language of Alan Savory there because I think it's such a great phrase. These are an essential component of the way the Earth is meant to function. And these pictures are, to me, a really important illustration of what the Earth probably looked like, vast areas of the Earth once looked like, and they're just little tiny remnants remaining now. And this is the Arctic, the caribou of the Arctic grazing, and you see they're very huge numbers and they're very densely congregated. So again, earlier today it was stated a lot of environmental groups want like a 15,000 acre tract and 20 animals, Well, that's not how the earth ever functioned, okay? And so if you want the ecosystems to function properly, if you want the soil organisms to function properly, you're going to have to replicate the way the earth evolved. And that's what these grazing herds show us. Here's a picture, similarly, of the Cape buffalo migrating across the Serengeti. And here's, we have very few bison remaining, but there's no doubt, when you read the accounts from Lewis and Clark, even still at that time, there were probably far fewer then than there had been before that, but they talked about this multitude covering the entire plains. That it was unimaginable that you'd get in front of one of these things because you'd be, trampled in 2 seconds. I mean, they were just this mass moving across the plains, and they trampled everything that they went across. So this idea that, we need to have a couple cattle just like tiptoeing, it's just wrong. And I think that Alan Savory has done a wonderful job of making that case. And if anyone in this room hasn't seen his TED Talk, do it right away. It's a beautiful argument about how we need the domesticated grazing animals to replace the disappeared wild ones. That's my big picture argument. Now I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about our ranch because people are usually interested in that too. Oh, there's one other picture. So this is just an artist's rendition. Now you often see a couple, again, you see like one mastodon and one lion or something in these prehistoric pictures that people came up with. But this picture shows you this idea of these large groups of animals. And there are some other illustrations that do this as well, but I used this one because this is an illustration of what North America probably looked like. And so I think this is an important picture. Now, one other point I want to make before I move on to our ranch, I forgot, I had 2 more slides. I recently had an interesting experience. I was doing a speaking event up in Northern California at a very beautiful event space and restaurant, and there was a very sophisticated audience, a lot of people involved in agriculture and a lot of people involved in advocacy around agriculture, and one of them was actually a guy who's written big books about concentrated animal feeding operations, and he sort of challenged this notion. He said, cattle don't even belong in North America. And I said, well, it may, yes, that may be true to the extent that the modern animal is not one that originated from this region, but to suggest that there was no animal having a similar impact here is absurd. So here are just 2 examples of animals that probably had a very similar kind of impact on the land. And this one is called a shrub ox, and this is a woodland musk ox. And these are prehistoric North American animals that lived in large herds on the American landscape. So don't let anybody tell you that cattle are a foreign animal that was introduced here and that's why they cause all this havoc. This is what this guy said. Okay, and he's a really smart and well-informed guy, but very wrong on this point. Okay, so here are a few slides from our ranch. I mentioned we're just north of San Francisco. The town we're in is called Bolinas, and we're in Marin County. And we are right on the coast of the Pacific, as you'll see in a moment. A couple of you in this room have been there, and you're all welcome, not all at once, but anyone who's in the Bay Area and wants to come visit us, please get my email from one of the organizers, and we always welcome people, especially people in agriculture. We're happy to show you what we do and discuss with you. This is a picture that I include deliberately for a couple of reasons. One is because it's got my handsome husband and my wonderful Great Dane Claire in there, and I love both of them so much I like seeing them. But also it shows you the climate there. There are 5 parts of the world that are characterized as a Mediterranean climate, which is kind of a moderate temperature, and there's only a season where there's rain, and the rest of the time it doesn't rain. And that's very different than the Midwest, and being someone who grew up around here, it's really foreign to me, but after 12 years I'm starting to get used to it. But this shows you the dry season. So I show it for that reason, but also to show that we do feed hay, because sometimes that question comes up. And during the dry season, we do feed hay. We feed a very small amount of hay, and sort of quantitatively, it's far less than 1% of the total amount that any of our animals will eat in a given year. But I just feel like sort of in terms of full disclosure, it's important to note that we do feed some hay. And we bring it in. It's not something that we can grow where we live. So this is just a picture of me with one of our calves, trying to give a little ranching credentials to myself there. That's actually me out on the ranch. And this is a picture of my husband Bill, again, with our heritage turkey flock, which goes outside every day on the grass and goes into a barn at night. We have livestock guardian dogs. There's one of them in the picture there, and they do a great job. And I'm not going to say too much about the turkeys because I don't think you guys are probably that interested in it, but that's part of what we do as well. And I just want to end there's a picture that shows the Pacific Ocean there. That's our ranch going up to the edge there. But this is also my favorite cow who just died a couple of weeks ago, and her name's Girlfriend. Those of you who have read my first book, Righteous Pork Chop, I talk quite a bit about her story. And to me, she just kind of symbolizes everything that's good about today's agriculture when it's grass-based and well-managed, because she is someone who was there a long time. We got to know her very well. We feel we learned a lot from her, and she provided us a lot, and we really miss having her there. So that's all I want to say. I thank you so much for your attention, and I welcome your questions.